So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. The University of California Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County would like to welcome you to Growing Great Basil. This program is being co-sponsored by the Santa Clara City and Santa Clara County Library Systems. My name is Sharon Erickson. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Santa Clara County, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's session. So before we get started, a few words about Zoom settings. We are recording this session, so please keep your microphone muted and your video off. We recommend you use speaker view, particularly as Louise is going to be showing you some plants during the demonstration part of this session. Closed captioning is available. You can find the controls on the bottom of your screen. Tonight's session is scheduled to go from 7 to 8 p.m. Please use the chat function to send us any questions that you have at any time during this session. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions at the end of Louise's presentation as we can. And we'll give you a place where you can go for other questions if we don't get to all of them. And now I'd like to introduce your presenter for tonight's class, Louise Christie. Louise is a longtime gardener, a great teacher, and an active UC Master Gardener volunteer. She's been a volunteer with Master Gardeners since 2011. So, one other thing, I did want to mention that during the session, I'll be posting some links into the chat where you can find additional information. And I'm going to start, while Louise gets started, by posting a PDF of tonight's presentation. You may want to click it now in the chat to download it for future reference. And with that, Louise, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Sharon. I really appreciate all your help with this. Hi, everybody. I'm Louise Christie, and I'm here to talk to you about growing great basil. This is hopefully going to be a relatively short talk and pretty casual. Please, any questions you have, just go ahead and put them in the chat. And let's get started. I can get my computer to work. Okay. There we go. Just really quickly about the Master Gardeners. We are volunteers and we are trained to bring science-based information about horticulture and pest management and sustainable landscaping to the public. And we have a fantastic help desk. If you have any plant questions, gardening questions at all, our help desk is the place to go. And you can Google that by just Googling Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County, and you'll get their website. It's fabulous. So let's talk about some basil basics. First of all, just the taxonomy of basil. How does basil fit into the plant world? So basil is in the family Lamiaceae, which are the mints. And those are the plants that have square stems. And you can see in the lower left a cross-section of the stem. So mint, basil, they have that square cross-section of their stem. They have opposite leaves. That means the leaves come out from the same point in the stem and they go opposite. And their flowers tend to be produced on spikes. You can compare the photo at the top and the photo at the lower right are both basils. One is Thai basil and one is a Genovese basil. And the photo at the lower left here, this is peppermint. And you can see the opposite leaves here that peppermint has and all the mints have, and it's pretty much the same as the basil. So same family, Lamiaceae, the mints. Interestingly, most of a lot of our familiar culinary herbs are in this family. And I didn't even know this. I learned this doing research for this talk. Thyme, oregano, rosemary, and lavender are also in the family Lamiaceae. So really strongly scented herbs seem to be in this family a lot. Let's see. So the basils are in the genus Ocimum. So all the basils will start with Ocimum. Ocimum this, Ocimum that. They are mostly annuals. A very few are perennial in their native habitat, but mostly they're annuals. That means that they grow, they bloom, they produce seed, and they die in 1 year, in one season. So now we're digging down a little bit. So all of these in this list, these are all basil species. They all start with osmum, that's the O, and there's a lot of basil plants. My herb encyclopedia says there are 7 species of basil that are really common, and those are the ones that are listed here. But there are 30 to 150 other actual species of basil. There are a lot of basils all around the world. Basil is native to, and it grows wild in the tropics and the subtropics on all the hemispheres all around the world. And that's a hint, it's a tropical plant. So that means that it likes warmth and humidity and very strong light. Just keep that in mind, tropics, right? Many of the basils purportedly have medicinal properties, and a lot of them have religious importance to many, many cultures. For example, Osmum kilimanjaricum, camphor basil, is native to East Africa and is used medicinally in Africa and India, where it is also called Kapur tulsi. Osmum tenuiflorum is holy basil, and apparently it's also sometimes called Kapur tulsi. And there are several varieties of holy basil that are grown in India and Nepal. Another interesting species that I noted is Osmum seloi, which is from Chiapas in southern Mexico, and it apparently has a green pepper flavor and aroma. I've never seen this plant, but I'd really like to try that one someday. And then African blue basil is one of my favorites. It is probably a hybrid, actually, of Osmum kilimanjaricum and Osmum basilicum purple basil. So I am going to be talking today about just these, the sweet basils, but I thought I'd give you some background about all these other different species because they're pretty interesting. Naturally hybridize between and among the different species. This has implications for seed savers. Excuse me, my internet connection is a little unstable, but I will come back each time, I promise. If you're trying to save seed for basil, you really have to protect it from cross-pollination because basil does very easily hybridize among its own self. But I'm not going to get into seed saving here. But also because they hybridize really easily naturally, there's a lot of confusion in the plant world and commercial seed industry about the different basils. So you'll see the same plant with different names, or you'll see different plants with the same name when it comes to basils. So just a little confusion there. If I haven't named a basil species that you know, it's because there's just so many of them. So again, for our purposes tonight, I'm going to be talking about Osmum basilicum, which is sweet basil. That's the one that's commonly grown for eating. And there are a lot of varieties of sweet basil, and they break down into roughly these groups. And this isn't official. This is just something I found in the books that I was doing research. So there's the Genovese basils, the ones that have your standard green leaf or pesto kind of basil. There are varieties that have really large leaves. There are varieties that have the ruffled leaves. Those are the lettuce basils. There are all kinds of purple basils. If you look in a seed catalog, lots of purple ones of lots of different kinds. There are the more Asian styles, usually the Thai basils. There are fine-leafed ones that have really, really tiny leaves. And then there are ones that have different colored flowers, usually white, purple, some kind of pink color. And then they can be also classified by their aroma. Lemon, clove, and cinnamon are some of the more common ones. So again, lots and lots of different varieties of just Osmum basilicum. All of them are Osmum basilicum, sweet basil. And here, just because they're really beautiful, are some of the other, just some more pictures because I wanted to show you pictures. So this one on the upper left is Pesto perpetuo basil. I've grown this before. It's a really pretty plant. It doesn't produce flowers very much. I didn't find it very, it didn't tempt me to cook with it for, I don't know why, but I didn't feel like, gee, I should go make pesto with this plant. But it's a beautiful plant and it does have a really nice basil flavor. Siam Queen and other Thai basils are lovely. They have really beautiful purple flower spikes and very, very decorative in the garden. Then this one in the lower right is called serrata. That's one of the lettuce leaf basils. So you can see how roughly the basil leaves are there. So those are just a few. And if you look in the seed catalog, there are lots and lots and lots of other basils, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on all the different ones because there's so many. But one of the things I've also found really interesting is the chemistry of basil. And basically, it's the way that nature has manipulated the chemicals in the plant that determines the difference in the flavor of each different kind of basil. Again, they're all sweet basil, but they all have slightly different flavors. It's the chemicals that make the basil taste good. So the 7 chemicals listed here, I'm going to try and pronounce them. Linalool, which is flowery. Beta-caryophyllene has a spicy flavor. 1,8-cineol is a spicy camphor flavor. Eugenol gives you that clove. Methyl-cavicol gives you the anise flavor. Methylcinnamate gives you cinnamon, and citral gives you lemon. So it's the different amounts of these different chemicals that give you the different basil flavors. For example, Genovese, the one that we use most often for pesto, has the first 3 of those chemicals in different combinations, but it doesn't have the others as much. And then the Thai basils have a lot of this methyl cavicol. They have a much stronger anise flavor in the Thai basils. So kind of interesting. Basil makes a large amount of these essential oils. These are essential oils. And some kinds of basil are grown commercially just to get the oils out because they are a source of eugenol, for example. Pretty interesting chemistry in the basils. So I found some pretty fun things that you can do with basil, and I thought I'd go through them before I even get into growing it. He had this thing about salt-dried basil that I thought was just so interesting. Basically, he takes leaves of basil and layers them in a jar with salt, packs them in there with salt, and it preserves the basil leaves for a long time, and you can just take the leaves out and use them as needed. I just thought that was so cool. It was something I have not seen before, so I thought I'd share that with you. Another one is something that I used to do. I used to grow microgreens, and basil is a lovely, lovely little plant when it's a baby. I love it all the time, but it makes a really great little microgreen. And you can see here on the picture on the right, this is some Riesling poached apricots from a restaurant in San Francisco, which I'd love for you to go visit if you want to. It's called 1601 Bar and Kitchen. It's a really nice restaurant, if they're still in business now that we've had a pandemic. Anyway, basil made a really great little garnish for them. So that's one of the fun things you can do with basil. And another thing is to use basil in a bouquet. We have a master gardener who also has a little farm called Whitstable Farm, and she sells basil in her bouquets. The farm is called Whitstable Farm in, I think it's in Los Altos Hills. I'm not sure. Anyway, so basil makes a really great flower for bouquets because it's long lasting. And if you cut the stems every day, it can last for weeks. So really, really nice for bouquets. And then, of course, you can use basil as a houseplant, especially if you pick one up in the early spring when they first start coming into the nurseries and the stores. It's too cold to plant them outside. So you might just want to keep it inside. But if you do keep it inside, you need to give it the most sunny window you can possibly give it, because basil really, really, really wants sunshine. And or it likes a lot of sunshine. It can handle some shade, but it really likes sunshine. So if you keep it in the house, give it some sun as much as you can. And also, I mentioned earlier basil for essential oils, but this is a farm that is harvesting basil. This is in Hawaii, and I thought this was really interesting to see basil harvested with a combine like it was wheat. But these are fresh basil that they put in bunches and they sell it to restaurants and to the grocery stores. So when you pick up some basil in a grocery store, it may have actually been harvested by a machine like this from a huge field of basil. So pretty interesting to think of what I think of as a small herb to be a huge crop, right? I think that's pretty cool. And then, of course, basil is delicious to eat. So we grow it in the summertime along with our tomatoes and our eggplants, so we can make ratatouille or our peppers. It fits into that plant family, those summer vegetables and fruits really, really well. In the upper right here is some pesto, which is absolutely delicious, which is made with Parmesan cheese and olive oil and pine nuts and basil. Just fantastic. And then here on the lower right is some yummy takeout food that I got from a faux restaurant nearby. And lo and behold, there's a beautiful, beautiful branch of Thai basil right there on my takeout food. So yum, yum. Lots and lots of basil. And then another wonderful thing that you can do with basil is use it in drinks. So basil seeds are a little bit like chia seeds. When you get them wet, they exude this gelatinous substance. And I tell you, it is super cool to watch this happen. You put a couple teaspoons of basil in a basil seed in a cup and stir that up with some liquid, and it just blooms this gray blue gelatinous stuff and becomes very thick. And it could be used to make vegan jam. And then there are some cultures that put it in a lot of different drinks. I saw this great YouTube for how to do Royal Faluda ice cream. That's that one in the middle. It looks like a truly decadent drink. And it's thickened with basil seeds. So really, really cool use of basil there. You can buy basil seeds in bulk. I got some online. You get a bag with a whole lot of seed in it. That would not be seed that you would want to grow because it's probably, it might be viable, but it might very well not be viable. So, but you can eat it. Okay, so let's talk about how to grow basil after all that. So one thing that people like to do is get one from the grocery store. They have these great plants in the grocery store now. I bought this one in this picture here in pretty early April. Again, it was too early to plant it outside. It had been grown in a greenhouse. It had been fertilized like within an inch of its life. And there were lots and lots of plants in one pot. It was kind of weak when I took the plastic sleeve off. They went like this. It was not a happy plant. And you can see up here in the upper right, after a couple of weeks, this is what it looked like. I kept taking it outside to give it sun in the daytime, and then I had to bring it back inside at night because it was still in the 40s at night, and basil does not like that. So it was going in and out and in and out. But eventually I gave it more and more sun, kind of got it used to being outside, and then I was able to transplant it into this pot here. And I have been harvesting off of it for the last several weeks. The pesto in the previous picture was made from this plant. And it's a lot happier now that it's living outside where it really wants to be and getting a good amount of sunshine. Let's see, let me just check my notes. Basil does root along its stems. So I planted it fairly deep. You can see here in this picture here that some of the stems were long and stretched. I actually kind of bunched it up and I buried those when I planted the plant down here in this pot. And it seems to be doing just fine. So you can bury those long stems when you plant basil that way. And I also thinned out probably about a third of the really weak seedlings because some of them were just really sad and they didn't need to live anymore. Sorry. So that's one thing you can do is go with a grocery store plant. Another thing that you can do is you can buy a transplant from a nursery. Excuse me. Let me just take a little sip here. So nurseries start having basil in probably mid to late April. I suggest waiting until late April or early May to buy your basil, because in the nurseries, the plants are exposed to the cold nighttime temperatures and they're not going to be happy. So the later you get your basil transplants, the better, so that they will be used to warmer temperatures. When you buy a transplant, just like buying any other transplant, you should be looking for a plant that's sturdy, in good shape, has a nice structure. It should be healthy and vigorous. Make sure you check no diseases, no pests, no injuries on those plants that you're going to buy. If you think there might be an issue with the roots, go ahead and tap the plant out of the pot right there in the nursery and take a look at the roots so that they're not all root bound. You don't want to buy a plant that's really root bound. And then it's a good idea to buy younger plants if you can. Like this one here is a nice young plant. That way it'll do all its growing in your yard instead of in the nursery. And also you just want to make sure it has new growth and it's not wilted. This picture here, I will actually, let's see if I can stop sharing. Okay, so that is this plant here, and I'm hoping that people are seeing me on the screen and can see this plant. Interestingly, when I purchased this little, it was much smaller. I purchased this transplant. It's a bunch of purple basil plants. They were all seeded in the growers from the same bunch of seeds. But I talked earlier about how basil hybridizes, and it just goes, its seeds are not necessarily all that reliable. From the same seed packet came this little throwback here to the green type. So same seeds, just that's just what basil has a tendency to do. There's about 8 actual plants in this pot. This is not one plant. It's a group of 8 little plants. Anyway, that's the one that I was showing in that picture there. Let's see. Okay, that's this one. Only it's bigger now. So again, buy a transplant. They work great. And then you can also grow your own transplants first from seed. I don't have any pictures on this slide. I do have some pictures on the next slide. I'll just go quickly through the steps. This is for Santa Clara County climate, not for other places because of the dates I'm giving. So if you're going to grow transplants from seed, you probably want to start your seed indoors, but no earlier than March 1st. Don't do this in February. It's just not worth it. It's a really good idea to use purchased potting soil and wet your soil very well before you fill your containers. You can put them in little cell packs or little pots like the one that plant was in, whatever you want, but basil is subject to some fungal diseases. So it's probably a good idea to wash any containers that you're reusing with a 10% bleach solution. That's not always necessary for all plants, but I do recommend it for basil. Put about 4 to 8 seeds in each little pot or cell. Cover it with some soil and moisten it well. What then you want to do is put a plastic cover over the top of that and then keep it in a warm room in your house. And if you want, you can put it on a heat mat, but room temperature in your house is probably just fine for starting basil. And then as soon as you see any sign of green popping out of the soil, which would be within, I would say, 3 to 8 days, the minute you see that green germination happening, take the plastic off and give it light, lots and lots of light. If you have a grow light, that's ideal. And you can put the grow light really close to the top of the plant. Or if you don't have a grow light, you can just put it in strong sunlight from a window, just making sure that it doesn't get too hot. And then as it grows, pot it up if it's needed, and then transplant it outdoors no earlier than mid-April in our area. Believe it or not, even though we have beautiful warm days in April, the nights are still too cold for basil. Think about basil like tomatoes and eggplants and cucumbers. They're all kind of warm season. They want warm weather. So you want to wait until mid to late April or even May before you put them outdoors. And then here's just some pictures of what I was just talking about. In the upper left is a picture of some basil seed, little tiny black seeds. And we've got a picture of someone who has started some basil here in an egg carton. Now, I don't recommend using egg cartons usually, but this person is a master gardener and she seems to love doing it. So if it works for her, it might work for you. Notice that the egg carton that she has here, this is a styrofoam one. It is not paper. I definitely would not recommend starting in a paper egg carton unless you're really going to keep it wet all the time, because paper will suck the moisture out of the potting medium. So if you do use an egg carton, a styrofoam one might work better. And then here's what I meant about put some plastic on. Just put some kind of saran wrap over it or put it in a bag just to keep it humid after you have watered the soil. And as long as it's in that bag, you probably won't need to water it again until after it has started to germinate. And then immediately once it germinates, you want to give it some nice strong sun and let it grow. So pretty easy to grow basil from seed, actually. I've grown a lot of basil from seed, and it's not a hard plant. If you find that you have basil seed that doesn't germinate, it's either probably that you didn't give it enough warmth or that the seed was not viable to start with and you need to buy a new batch of seed, or maybe use a higher quality seed supplier. So another thing that you can do is you can direct seed it in the ground. Again, don't do this before mid-April in Santa Clara County, because you want that soil to be warm. Really, really wants warm soil for good germination. If you're planting it directly in the ground, you're going to plant it where it's going to live. You need to find a location that has really good sunshine, at least 4 hours of direct sunshine. Now, unlike most vegetables like tomatoes, where we want 8 hours, basil can handle about a half day. So even though it's a sun lover, it's one of those lovely plants that can actually tolerate some shade. So, but you do want at least 4 hours of really good solid sun. Just plant it in a really well-prepared, well-amended soil in your vegetable garden or somewhere else, anywhere else in your garden, really. But it should be well-amended and have good drainage. You can put lots of compost in there, or you could buy an amendment if you want to, but homemade compost is really great. And plant the seeds according to the seed packet. Just cover them lightly with soil, water them well, keep them moist, but not soggy. And then don't overwater them once the seedlings come up, because again, there's a little bit of a fungal issue with basils. So you want the soil to dry out just a tiny bit between irrigations. And if you're having pest problems on little tiny seedlings, you can put some row cover over. I meant to bring some, but I don't have it with me. It's that lightweight fabric, lightweight synthetic fabric that you can buy to cover up plants. If you want some, just Google row cover and get the lightweight kind. But basil doesn't have a lot of pest problems, so I don't think that you would need to use that necessarily if you're going to direct seed in the ground. Again, basil's pretty easy to grow, actually. If you want to, you can grow it from a cutting. In order to do that, you have to already have a basil plant. So what you want to do is cut about a 4-inch stem. You should cut from a fairly mature stem, not one that's super weak and flexible. I actually tried this spring with that first plant I was showing you. And this is what I cut. And then here's it rooting in some water. And it did finally root, but not very well. So I think it didn't root very well because it was a very weak stem to start with, because it had been growing in a greenhouse in early April and wasn't very happy. So if you have a basil plant that's growing outside in the summer and it's nice and strong, go ahead and take some cuttings and you can put the stem in water and you will get roots. And do change the water daily to make sure that there's still some oxygen getting to the stem. And you might want to cut the end off just to make sure the water is still getting in. And then once you've got some nice roots going on, just put it in a pot and let it grow, give it some water, and you'll have a really happy plant. So yeah, you can grow basil from cuttings. And in fact, some plants, some basil plants that are hybrids only can be grown from cuttings, like the African blue, which I will show you in a minute. Okay, so that's another way to get a basil plant, is from cuttings. Once your basil's growing, what do you want to do? You want to eat it, right? So if you're going to harvest your basil, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that basil, being an annual plant, its goal is to make flowers and go to seed, and it'll do it pretty quickly. So what you want to do is cut it back, pinch it back. And according to what I've read in the various books that I've looked at, once it reaches a certain number of leaves, and I think it's about 8 leaves on a stem, that's kind of the signal to the plant to start flowering. So you want to pinch it way back. So pinch it down into to where there's only maybe a couple leaves left on the stem to induce branching. None of the books that I looked at for this talk repeated what I had heard often, which may even be a myth, that the leaves lose their flavor once the plant starts flowering. Granted, they may not be, texturally, they might not be as strong, or they might just, they might be a little bit different, but nobody has specifically emphasized to pinch it to maintain flavor, but it is pinched to maintain leaf production, and it's the leaves that we want to eat. So when you pinch or cut, I've got a picture here. Let me show you this. There we go. So again, you want to go kind of deep into the plant and do your cut. And one of my sources, which I'll show you these books at the end, recommends using sharp scissors or a sharp knife and not pinching, so that that wound is cleaner and it will heal better. And I know a lot of people pinch their basil. Either way is probably fine. But if you want to experiment, you could try using a knife and see if it heals faster. So again, do that on all the branches of your plant in order to keep it producing leaves for you as long as possible. And then maybe, sometime in midsummer, you'll get the feeling from the plant that it really wants to make flowers, and you'll just go ahead and let it do that. But if you want to make pesto, you're going to be pinching a lot off of your basil plant so that you have a good solid amount of leaves to make your pesto with. And then again, basil is pretty easy to grow. It'll be happy in your garden if it gets a good 4 hours of sun. Just a little tiny bit about diseases. Basil does get a couple of fungal type diseases, or ones that look like fungus. So first of all, it gets Fusarium wilt, and that's a soil-borne fungus, and it can live in the soil for many years. So if you have a problem with this, you might want to grow your basil in a different place in your yard, or in a container with fresh potting soil. It causes the tips, as you can see here, some of these tips to just suddenly wilt because the fungus gets into the stem here. I think you can see that. And it just literally clogs up the stem so that there is no transference of water up into the stem. And so the plant will die. It's not a very pleasant thing to have in your basil. I've had it before. What I would do is just take that plant and cut off any good leaves to eat and throw the rest in the garbage. This fungal leaf spot here in the center is one that I have not seen before, but it is apparently relatively common. And it again is a fungus. And then the one on the right is called downy mildew. And downy mildew is actually not a mildew or a fungus. It is I've got it here. It's a water mold. It's not a fungus. There's tiny little algae-like microbes called oomycetes that cause the downy mildew. Downy mildew did not used to exist in California, but it is here now, and it is a problem for commercial basil growers especially. And you can see here what happens is in between the veins in this picture, it turns yellow. And then if you look at the underside of the leaf, there's a light purple fuzz, and that's the spores there. that cause the downy mildew, and then eventually it will kill the plant. Again, because downy mildew is now a problem for the professional growers, the plant breeders have been breeding lots of different varieties of basil to be resistant to downy mildew. And you can also get basil seeds that are resistant to fusarium wilt. So if you have a problem with the diseases in your own garden, go ahead and look in a seed catalog for disease-resistant basil seeds, and you'll probably have much, much better luck with your plants. In the case of fungal leaf spots and downy mildew, water on the leaves is a contributing factor. So the spores actually travel in the water. So when you water basil in general in your garden, you should use drip irrigation or a soaker hose on the soil, or if you're using a watering can or watering by hand, just make sure that you don't get the leaves wet very much. This is not a plant that you want to rinse off a lot. Keep it dry, just water at the base of the plant, and that should help to avoid some of these fungal and other diseases. But mostly it's not that big of a problem. I've grown a lot of basil with no problems whatsoever. And again, for all of these types of diseases, probably the best thing to do if you have a problem is to just dispose of the infected plants in the garbage. Don't try to compost it, just don't mess with it, put it in the garbage. And also another thing I forgot to mention is don't crowd your plants together too much so there's a good air circulation. That always helps with fungal problems. Okay, so that's about it for diseases, not too bad. And then pests are even easier. Basil doesn't have a lot of pest problems. There you might have some snails and slugs. This is a plant that I have. It's that same plant, actually. It's out in the backyard and it's got some holes in it. I have no idea what has caused those holes, some sort of insect, but I don't have a lot of snails and slugs in that container. So what I'm doing and what I recommend that you do is if the problem is not real bad, just pinch that part off and go make pesto and let the rest of it grow. If you fertilize your plant and keep it happy and keep it growing fast, it'll outgrow the pest damage. If you have a real problem with snails and slugs, you can hand pick them off, especially at night. You can go out and hand pick them and throw them in a bucket or of soapy water to drown them, or squish them under your foot, or whatever is your preferred method to deal with snails and slugs, just to keep them off your basil plants. They can have a little bit of problem with other insects. Some whiteflies can be a small problem, but again, for the most part, basil is fairly pest-free. If you have a strong localized infestation of some kind of insect, you can use something like an insecticidal soap. That should be just fine if you choose to go that route. But if you do use something like an insecticidal soap, do make sure that you check first to see if there are any beneficial insects waiting to eat those other insects. You might have a ladybug that's just coming along to eat that, eat those whiteflies or eat the aphids if you're having an aphid problem, and you don't want to spray the ladybugs. So, again, be judicious in your use of insecticides. But I think because of the strong flavor of basil, it's just generally not that tasty to a lot of insects, and they don't know what pesto is. So more problems for them. And then lastly, I just want to briefly mention basil is a fantastic plant for beneficial insects. And this is a garden that I used to have, and it was in a restaurant or outside of a restaurant. And I grew a lot of basil there. And my favorite plant, one of my favorite plants of all actually, is African blue basil. And you can see there's a photo here of some bees on the African blue basil, and this shows where it is in this garden. And here is a potted plant, which I will also show you in a minute. A story about this particular African blue basil plant. There was a young woman, she was a sous chef in the pastry kitchen at this restaurant, and she was terrified of bees and other flying insects. And I, talked to her and I showed her around the garden and tried to help her understand that the insects were not interested in hurting her. And by the end of the summer, I watched her walk past that African blue basil plant, which had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bees on it. And she just pushed right through, picked some flowers off of it, picked some tomatoes from behind, wasn't at all afraid of the bees anymore. And it's just a story that I love about that particular plant. And what I'd like to do now is show you my African blue basil plant that I had. I bought this, it was probably a little bit smaller, maybe 2/3 this size when I bought it as a transplant. It's not a native, sorry, it's in I potted it up into the pot that has California native sticker on it. But you can see the beautiful flowers that the African blue basil has. This is the typical flower formation of a mint family plant. The flowers are on a spike. Think about lavender also. Lavender has flowers on a spike here. And if I cut the stem, it would have that square cross section. And I don't know if you can see, but it has the opposite leaves. So again, typical mint family plant. One thing about African blue basil, though, we don't eat it. It doesn't really have that great a taste. It's more, well, it smells okay. I mean, you could use it if you wanted to, but it's not generally considered to be a culinary basil, but it will grow into a beautiful, about 3 foot by 3 foot plant in your garden and attract tons of beneficial insects for you. So I'm going to put this back. And I think, let's see. That is pretty much all that I have to say. Again, basil is a great plant to grow. I hope you enjoyed me sharing some of my favorite things about basil with you. I do want to recommend a couple of books. This book is called The Encyclopedia of Herbs, and it's fantastic. And I noticed the author is one of the authors is Thomas DiBaggio. And then I found this book, Basil and Herb Lover's Guide. I think it's out of print. I got this one used, and it's really fun because it's written by Thomas DiBaggio, who's an herb expert, and a chef, Susan Belsinger. So it's an herbalist and a chef who wrote a book together about basil. So a lot of what I shared with you today is from these books. So again, I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Oh, yes, Louise, we have a ton of questions. So
I'm not an expert, but I've read a lot about it.
So let's start through the list. So Virginia is asking, she's always read that the flavor of basil suffers if you let it flower. Is that true?
I think I mentioned that earlier. None of the books, these books that I read and more, many websites, many books, none of them mention that. And I had heard that before also. I think that I don't think that it's true. Personally, I don't think that it really affects the flavor that much. I have used basil leaves from the top, from just below the flower for pesto and not had any problem. The thing is that you do want to pinch your basil so that it will make more leaves, because it's the leaves that we want to eat. So we do want to, if we're growing our basil for leaves, we want to make sure that we cut it back. When a branch gets to have about six leaves, that's 3 pairs of leaves on it, it's time to pinch it back. So cut it back so that there's just 2 or 4 leaves on that branch, and you use that tip, and that will cause it to branch more and give you more leaves. But I have not found any evidence that it's true about the flavor. Of course, you can go and test that by having a young basil plant and an old one, and just try them and see what you think, if the flowers make it taste different to you.
You know, speaking of the size of the leaves, so Jean was saying that her new leaves seem to get smaller as time goes on. Is there a way to do that or to fix that?
I have noticed that too. And I think that's the nature of the way it grows. I think that the bottom leaves are bigger, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller until it starts to want to produce that flower spike. So again, what you want to do is pinch that off and pinch deep into the plant, down into where there's, just 2 or maybe 4 leaves left on that stem, and take all the rest of the way. And that will induce it to grow more new leaves. And those should be bigger. Another thing is fertilize it. I didn't talk about fertilizer, but you do want to give your basil fertile soil. Either if you're planting it in a container, give it a really high quality potting soil, or if you've got it in the ground, I would recommend a good quality organic fertilizer to prep the soil, or you can use a synthetic fertilizer if you want to. Actually, it doesn't matter to me, but give it some fertilizer and it will make bigger, greener leaves for you.
And speaking of fertilizers, Mark asked, what did you mean by well-amended soil?
Well-amended soil is soil that you would want to grow in. That's the best way I can say it, is if you go out and you take your trowel and you put it into your planting bed and it just goes in nice and soft, and you can just dig a little hole and it's fluffy and it feels good and it's dark, that's usually well-amended soil. Well-amended soil has a lot of organic matter in it. So in most of Santa Clara County, we have clay soil, and it doesn't have a lot of organic matter in it because it's been planted with houses. So if you're going to amend clay soil, we have whole videos about how to do that, but basically it means year after year after year after year, adding compost into that soil. And if this is a bed where you're growing vegetables or probably cutting flowers or basil, you do want to dig in the amendment. If it's a place where you're growing shrubs, you don't need to dig in the amendment. That's a different story. But for vegetable bed or your basil bed, you want to dig that compost into the soil and do it twice a year. Dig in, an inch or 2 of compost. And in 10 years or so, you will have fabulous soil. And it's true. It really is true. What you will get is a soil that is crumbly. It's darker color. It has a lot of organic matter in it. And it also has that wonderful clay, which gives it a really good water holding capacity, and is really actually very nutritious for the plants. So the combination of clay and compost mixed together year after year after year makes fabulous soil. But again, compost is your amendment.
Joyce was asking, several of the pictures you showed and the plants you showed were in groups.
Yes.
Is it better to seed basil in a group or seed it individually?
That's a really interesting question, because I have always thought that it's better to have one seed per cell of any plant that I'm growing, because my training and my experience has taught me that plants compete with each other for nutrients in the soil. And yet I did show you a pot with about 8 little purple basil plants in it. And lo and behold, the experts that I consulted, they say basically basil grows really well if you put, 4 to 8 seeds in one pot. So your basil plant is actually multiple plants. So it does work well that way. However, the African blue basil that I showed you is one plant in its pot. So you can go either way. Again, that's something you might want to experiment with. Grow some where you have one plant per pot and some where you have groups, and see what you think. This one here, this is I just purchased this not too long ago from a very popular small grocery store. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 plants in this pot. So, you can get a lot of leaves off of this, but each one of these is not going to grow to its full mature size because it is crowded, but it seems to work pretty well. So whatever works for you, 1 or 9.
So Amber had a question about flowering. Her basil has started flowering when it's still pretty immature.
Mm.
What advice do you give to avoid that in the future?
Remember, it's an annual plant and it really, really wants to flower. That is its goal for the year, for the summer, is to flower, make seeds, and die, because it wants to make those seeds. Probably what happened is that it got into some really warm weather and it's like, oh, it's summer, I'm gonna go seed right now. Plants that are stressed by not having good enough soil or not enough water or too much heat also are more likely to bolt and go flower sooner. So that might have been the situation with your basil plant. You cannot take a plant that's already flowering and switch it back off. It's done. It's like it's gone where it was planning to go, which is to make flowers. So what I suggest you do is go get another basil plant. And throughout the summer, I will buy more basil plants or plant more basil plants because I like to have basil available all summer long and at different stages. So realistically, one plant probably won't last you the summer. You might need to kind of get several. But you can't turn it back into an only leafy plant once it's started to flower. And again, do the pinching thing, pinch deep in. Here, I'm going to demonstrate that. I should have done that before. Let's see, let me stop sharing. Okay, so here's the plant from the very popular small grocery store. Here's I hope you can see this.
Hold it steady.
I'm separating out one of the stems here. And when I pinch this, I'm not just going to pinch this little bit off the top. I'm going to go all the way down here to where I see two little branches coming and pinch it down there. So it looks like a pretty drastic pinch, but that's the kind of pinching you want to do. Take off a lot. And I could do that over this whole plant. And in 2 weeks, you would not even know that I had done it. But that will keep the leaf production going and delay the flowering.
Excellent. I think you answered a couple of questions right there. Yes. And now we have basil. Janelle suggests that you freeze it in ice cube trays. So Tara and several other people have white insects. So she says her basil plants seem to attract white insects every time. What are they? How do you avoid getting them? For Pharma's has white dots on the leaves. I think it's probably same thing.
Yeah. This is where my expertise is a little weak. I believe the white insects are probably whitefly. It does tend to get whitefly. I would go out there and shake them off. That doesn't sound very sophisticated, but that's what I would do. And if you have a bad look at the underside of the leaves also and see if you see clusters. And if your whitefly infestation is bad and you can't just shake them off repeatedly, you might want to go the route of something like an insecticidal soap. And then of course you would want to wash that off really well before you ate the plant. But I believe that's whitefly.
Yeah, I just wash them off with a strong stream from the hose.
Yeah, that's a good idea too. Yeah, I tend to be very easy on the insects and just hope something comes along to eat them, but that's not everybody else's choice. So,
Kathy asked what kind of home ingredients you can use to prevent pests on basil or mint. The problem is that you want to use these herbs without cooking them. So you too will ingest whatever it is
right.
you put on your plant.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us tend to just try to wash them off.
I want to put in a really strong master gardener statement about using home remedies for insecticides. Dawn dishwasher detergent, vinegar, Epsom salts, alcohol. These are not for use in the garden, period. End of story. That is not what they're meant for, and they're not for plants. And they're not any more natural or good for you than something that you buy in the hardware store. in fact, you might hurt yourself because you don't know what the dosage is of something like a detergent. So if you must go the route of using an insecticide, I strongly recommend that you go read the labels on the insecticides in the hardware store or the nursery. Get something that works for you. You might want to choose something very organic, that's fine. But those products have been tested and they tell you how much to use, and they're meant for working on plants. That is, I feel really strongly about that we really shouldn't use things like dishwashing detergent on our plants. So use what's been tested, and or use water. Spraying water on your plants often gets rid of the insects. And then, of course, beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings and all of those wonderful other insects that you want to attract to your garden, they will help you take care of the insects that are eating your plants.
And I hope we have time for one more question.
And I'm sorry we don't
get,
I'm happy.
get to everything. But can you talk a little bit about basil's water needs?
Oh yeah, I didn't talk much about that. So let's remember, where does basil come from? It comes from the tropics, in the jungle. I know not everywhere in the tropics is moist, but most of the places in the tropics do get a lot more rain than we get in Santa Clara County. Basil does love water. You do need to keep it moist. It can handle drying out once in a while. That's fine, but it's not a drought tolerant plant. So give it water. If you must have a frequency, I would water a plant that's in the ground at least once a week in the summer, if not more. In pots, you may need to water it every day. You do want to give it a good amount of water. It's more like growing a vegetable like lettuce that needs water. But again, don't get the water on the leaves, because that will that might cause or make fungal problems worse.
So I want to, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Louise for putting together this presentation. I have learned a lot about basil. And yes, I do plant basil with my tomatoes. Somebody asked a question about that.
Oh, yeah,
it's
of course.
Kind of
like what?
Family,
like, yeah.
It's a family tradition because they get eaten together.
Right. I mean, what else would you do, right?
If you have any more specific questions about something that's growing in your garden, you can always contact the Santa Clara County Master Gardeners Help Desk. Just go to our website. And I want to thank Louise again for the presentation, and thank you to the Santa Clara County Library System and the Santa Clara City Library for co-sponsoring the event, and to all of you for attending and for your questions. I'd like to turn it over if Nevin or Bob from the libraries, our librarians in residence, would like to say anything before we close off tonight. Nevin, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Louise and Sharon, organizing this event. And Santa Clara City Library is really happy to be sponsor of this program. I am looking forward to the next ones. So I posted Santa Clara City Library event calendar if you are interested in other programs. So, and also I am posting the YouTube channel. We have also talks about other topics you can watch. Thank you, and see you again.
Yeah. And Bob, did you want to say anything? Thank you, Nevin.
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining in, watching this wonderful program, and thank Louise and you, Sharon, for putting it on. The Master Gardeners are always do wonderful programs, and we're looking again forward to the next one. We have a number of books and a couple videos on herb growing in the Santa Clara County Library system holdings. If anyone is interested in more information that they can check out. We will be posting the video on our YouTube website in a little while. so that people can view it there also. So just thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Nevin. Thank you to the libraries for co-sponsoring. And thank you again, Louise. So have a good evening, everybody. Take care and happy gardening.